Let's talk about nominating for election, because an upper house MP here in state parliament wants to change electoral laws so voters can see who's nominated essentially the day they nominate, not after nominations close, which is currently the case. Sarah Game, State One Nation MLC on the line. Sarah, good morning.
Good morning.
So why do you want this change?
Well, I think it's certainly become apparent to myself and many in the community, I think, that councils are becoming quite politicised. And I think it's really important in that environment, particularly, that the community is aware in advance who's put themselves up in their local area to run for council. I think it's a great thing if that then incentivises others to put their hat into the ring. I mean, just on that, we've seen councils voting to dedicate council money to fund the Yes campaign in The Voice recently. And I think it's really important that, why would we have secret nominations where others in the community only find out, after the nomination date has closed? That makes no sense to me.
Do you think more people might nominate if they knew who was already standing, where you might think, well, I've got a chance against this person, or I don't like this person, I'm just going to stand to oppose them for the sake of it? I mean, is that what it's about?
Well, I think people have got every right to say, look, I want to provide an alternative to that person that's running. And I think that anything we can do to increase engagement, increase transparency and accountability around the local government election process is a good thing. I mean, we've seen councils actually have insufficient nominations and then have to run elections again. We certainly are seeing situations of insufficient choice, low voting numbers, and frankly, we're seeing, I think, dissatisfaction in the community with the representation with councils in certain situations. And so I think anything we can do to incentivise civic engagement and service is a positive step.
If people were thus engaged and if they were motivated already, wouldn't they just nominate regardless?
I don't think so. I think there are a number of things by seeing someone nominate themselves and that publicised immediately. I think it can give confidence to others, that I can do this too, and it can increase a community awareness that there's actually a local government election going on. I think a lot of people, as you know, there's very low voting participation, and I think a lot of people in their busy lives aren't even aware. And I think it's a good way to incentivise others and say, okay, I want to provide an alternative. I think there are lots of things that can lead people to public duties, and I think people aren't always aware of that initially. So I think it's only a positive step to find out early who's put themselves up in your local area. As
opposed to the end of the nomination period. Well, wouldn't it then just result in some people, if not all, many, most, I don't know, just deciding we're going to nominate last minute on the day, the final day nominations closes when we're putting our nominations in?
I think, look, that's definitely a possibility. I don't think that's a reason to not introduce a piece of legislation that encourages transparency and accountability. I think that when the community is provided with a choice of someone who's willing to put themselves up early and to be scrutinised by the community early, I think that would be respected. And I don't think it's a positive look for somebody to wait till the 11th hour to put themselves up just before nomination closes. So I think ultimately that still ends up providing the public with a choice.
What about other polls? You're talking council elections. Should it apply for state government, state elections and federal elections?
I think it should certainly, I think people should always know in advance. I mean, particularly, I think, we have had a chat recently, and it's certainly very topical at the moment, the local voice elections that are going on. And we've seen the same scenario there. I mean, I've spoken out, obviously, a number of times to say that I don't actually support establishing a separate bureaucratic arm, but I do believe that if we have got one, that people have a right in those Aboriginal communities to know who's put themselves up for nomination before nominations close.
On The Voice, and I put this to Kai Ma, the attorney, recently when nominations had closed, we were told all the way through last year this is so vitally important, at least for the federal voice, for the referendum part of the campaign. This will give Indigenous communities their say, their voice, their rights will be respected and their voice heard. We have 43,000 Indigenous people in South Australia, according to the last census, and I'm surprised, the Attorney-General took it in his stride, but I'm surprised surprised, given that importance, that the emphasis that's been put on this. Only 113 people put themselves forward for 46 positions, which to me is incredibly low given the hype, I suppose, for want of a better word, around it.
It's an absolutely dismal number. I mean, I think it's well known, really, that many in the community feel that there was inadequate publication of this being an election promise. There's certainly been, I think, inadequate communication since about how this voice structure is actually going to work. I mean, I've said from the beginning that the voice is really just a name of a piece of legislation. It in no way guarantees that these people in these in-need communities are actually going to have a voice. And I think that the low level of people who've actually nominated themselves is evidence of that. As you know, I've been written to by various Aboriginal communities expressing their dissatisfaction with the process, saying that in fact there's no one that has nominated from their community, that they didn't know about it and they don't feel represented.
And that's too late now because nominations have closed.
Exactly, because nominations have closed, and that's another reason why I think in all these processes the communities have a right to know at the time who's put themselves up for nomination to incentivise others to provide an alternative, and not after it's too late when the date is closed for nomination. Well,
the Voice campaign, I suppose, is quietly underway at the moment because the vote is March 16, but we haven't heard much about it here in the city at all, and I don't know that we would necessarily, but clearly people must be out there campaigning. And it's a voluntary election, how many people need to vote, do you think, for it to be a success? Because we know with voluntary elections, the council election is the clearest guide of that, only about a third return their ballot paper. So I suppose if the Voice gets about a third, well, that would be at least on par. If it's any less, you'd have to look at it as being a failure, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. And just on your point earlier about it being very quiet, especially in the city of Adelaide, I mean, I certainly don't see much about it. I mean, we're going to be having, I believe, 11 members representing the city of Adelaide. So you would expect that there'd be an enormous amount of publicity around it at the moment, and there really isn't. And I think, as you know, I've got a voice repeal bill that I put forward because I believe really that the South Australian government should be listening to the voice of South Australia, which voted no against having this division within our community.
We'll see where it ends up. Sarah Game, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
17 to 11 on 5AA, Upper House One Nation MP in State Parliament, and calling for changes to electoral laws so people can see who has nominated the day they nominate for an election and not at the end when nominations close and all the names are released. So we should know immediately. And I suppose no harm in that. Part of her thinking, her reasoning is it might make others want to stand as a result, give the election publicity as well when people nominate, particularly if they've got a profile, because that would be newsworthy. Whether you'd say people should nominate anyway, not because somebody else has, whether they like them or dislike them, would be an argument, I suppose, against it. People should just nominate, and that's probably why they're not divulged previously or why there's a cut-off date to nominate by, I imagine. And there would be some who might wait till the 11th hour to put in their nominations as a result. But probably not a bad thing to do in a democracy, is if somebody nominates, we know who they are immediately.